They called it the Great Silence, but it was never truly silent. In the deep space comm relays and the forgotten data vaults, you could still hear the ghosts if you listened hard enough. I made a living listening to ghosts. My name is Ilara, and I'm a mender, one of the few who still practices the art of waking dead tech. My home is the Athenaeum, a city-sized archive station adrift in the Oort cloud of a forgotten star, a place where civilizations sent their technological remains to be cataloged and left to rust in peace. My workshop smelled of ozone, cold metal, and the faint, dusty scent of time itself. I preferred the company of machines. Their histories were complex but honest. Their failures etched in their circuits, not hidden behind carefully chosen words. 3 centuries ago, humanity had been the loudest voice in the galaxy, a chaotic symphony of expansion, innovation, and conflict. Then, they had simply stopped. No final broadcast, no cry for help, no wreckage, just a sudden, complete, and terrifying quiet that rolled across the cosmos like a shockwave. The other species, the Vex, the Cuthar, the crystalline Sill, after a century of nervous waiting, carved up their abandoned territories and scrubbed their name from the star charts. They taught their young that humanity had consumed itself. A cautionary tale of a species too bright and too fast. A star that collapsed under its own gravity. It was a neat, tidy explanation. It was a lie. We all knew it, deep down, in the places we didn't talk about. You don't erase a species like humanity. You just learn to live on top of their grave and pretend you don't feel the bones beneath your feet. I was working on a pre-silence artifact, a Terran designation lullaby box. It was a simple thing, meant for a child's room, designed to project holographic star fields onto a ceiling. It had been dark for 300 years. My job was to coax its heart into beating again, not for function, but for preservation. The Athenaeum's curators believed every piece of dead tech held a story, and it was my job to be its translator. As my diagnostic needle traced the microcircuitry, I felt it. Not a sound, not a vibration, but a resonance, a current of something that wasn't power. It felt like the echo of a sigh, a deep and ancient melancholy that settled in my bones. I pulled the needle back, the feeling vanishing. The lullaby box remained dark. I dismissed it as synaptic feedback, the ghost of an impression left by the device's original purpose. But the feeling lingered, a subtle sadness that clung to the air in my workshop like a forgotten perfume. A few days later, the whispers started. Not real whispers, but the digital kind. Other menders in the lower sectors started reporting phantom signals in their diagnostics, ghost data that would appear for a moment and then vanish before it could be logged. The station's central AI, the Warden, began rebooting its atmospheric processors at random intervals, citing uncategorized ambient energy fluctuations. People started talking about their dreams. It was the talk of the lower deck cantinas and the maintenance conduits. They were all dreaming the same thing, a field of tall, green grass under a yellow sun, a sky of impossible blue, and the overwhelming feeling of being lost. They would wake with the phantom taste of salt on their tongues and a hollow ache in their chests, a homesickness for a place they had never known. The Athenaeum's concordance authorities, led by a stern and by-the-book officer named Kale, issued a station-wide notice. It was a mimetic virus, they claimed, likely originating from a newly acquired data core from the Outer Rim. They advised routine neural scans and a system-wide data scrub. They were treating the symptom, not the cause. They were afraid to even look at the cause. The resonance from the lullaby box was getting stronger. It wasn't just a sigh anymore. It was a hum, a low, choral note that seemed to vibrate at the edge of hearing. I found myself leaving my tools on the bench, just sitting in the dim light of my workshop, listening. And as I listened, I began to see. They were flashes at first, quick and disorienting, like corrupted frames in a data stream. A small hand, fingers smudged with dirt, closing around a smooth, gray stone. The jarring shudder of a primitive atmospheric craft hitting turbulence. The face of a woman, her eyes filled with a love so fierce it felt like a physical blow. These images weren't mine. I had never seen a yellow sun or breathed unfiltered air. I had been born on the sterile, recycled atmosphere of the Athenaeum. Yet, they felt real. More real than the cold metal of my workbench or the hum of the station's life support. They felt like memories. I knew I should report it. Kale's directive was clear. Any tech exhibiting anomalous properties was to be surrendered for containment. But how could I surrender a memory? How could I explain that this child's toy was weeping? And I was weeping with it one night. I couldn't bear the quiet hum any longer. It was a song of such profound loneliness, a requiem for a billion lost souls, and it was calling to me. Ignoring the concordant seals on my workshop door, I placed my hands on the cool and smooth surface of the lullaby box. The moment my skin made contact, the universe fractured. It wasn't a vision, it was a relocation. I was no longer Ilara, the mender, in a workshop on a station of ghosts. I was a young boy named Leo. I was running through that field of green grass, the yellow sun warm on my face, the blue sky a perfect, aching dome above me. I could feel the tickle of the grass on my bare legs, the pounding of my own small heart, the breathless joy of being alive. A woman's voice called my name, a name that was not mine, but felt more mine than my own. Leo, come back, it's getting late. I turned, and I saw her, the woman from the flashes, my mother. She was smiling, and that smile was the center of the entire universe. And then, a shadow fell, not from a cloud, but from the sky itself, a vast and sudden darkness that swallowed the sun, the sky, the world. The warmth vanished, replaced by a cold that had nothing to do with temperature. It was the cold of absolute, irreversible loss. My mother's smile dissolved into a mask of terror. She screamed my name, but the sound was devoured by an immense, crushing silence. I was falling, not through the air, but through myself, through 1,000 other lives. 1,000 other moments of loss, all of them human, all of them crying out in a chorus of silent despair. I snapped back to myself, gasping on the cold floor of my workshop. The lullaby box was glowing, projecting a soft, golden light onto the ceiling. It wasn't a star field, it was a single, steady point of light. A star seen from a world that no longer existed. My entire body trembled, tears streaming down my face for a mother I never had and a world I never knew. That was when the door hissed open. Kyle stood there, flanked by 2 concordance officers, their faces grim, their weapons drawn. He took in the scene me, a sobbing wreck on the floor, the glowing, forbidden artifact, the tangible aura of sorrow that filled the room. His cold, gray eyes, the eyes of a man who believed in order above all else, widened for just a fraction of a second. I know he felt it. In that moment, he wasn't just an officer investigating a quarantine breach. He was a man standing on the edge of a forgotten grave, and he could feel the ghosts stirring beneath his feet. "What have you done?" he asked, his voice tight, strained. I looked from his hardened face to the single point of light on my ceiling, the ghost of a long-dead son, and I gave him the only answer I had, the answer that had been given to me by a lost little boy in a field of green. I whispered a word in a language that hadn't been spoken for 300 years, a word heavy with the impossible weight of memory and loss. Home. He didn't understand the word, but he understood the feeling behind it. He saw the truth I now carried, the truth that the whole galaxy had tried to bury. Humanity hadn't just died. They had remembered. And now, they were asking us to remember with them. Kale's face was a mask of rigid control, but I saw the flicker in his eyes, the involuntary twitch of a muscle in his jaw. The word home hung in the air between us, an artifact in itself, heavy and resonant. It was a sound his species, the Vex, had no equivalent for. Their concept of origin was tied to spawning creches and hive protocols, not to a single, emotionally charged place. He didn't understand the word, but the raw, unadulterated grief it carried was a universal language. The two concordance officers shifted uneasily, their weapons feeling suddenly useless against an enemy they couldn't target. The enemy in the room wasn't me. It was a feeling. For a long moment, the only sound was the soft, golden hum of the lullaby box, a beacon lit for a ship that would never return. Kyle finally broke the silence, his voice clipped and stripped of all emotion. A defense mechanism I recognized all too well. Contain the artifact. Take her to level Gamma for processing. Full mimetic quarantine protocols. His men moved with a practiced efficiency that felt like a violation. One placed a stasis field around the lullaby box. Its warm light instantly snuffed out, leaving an aching void in the room. The other grabbed my arm, his touch impersonal but firm. As they led me out, Kyle didn't follow. He remained in my workshop, standing over the dark, silent box, a man staring into an open grave and refusing to acknowledge the ghost standing beside him. Level Gamma was as sterile and silent as the rest of the Athenaeum pretended to be. It was a place of white walls, polished chrome, and the omnipresent, low hum of the station's core. There were no ghosts here, only the cold, hard logic of containment. My cell was a perfect cube, the air tasting of recycled oxygen and antiseptic. There was no furniture, only a recessed slab that served as a bed. It was designed to sensory deprive, to isolate a mind from any external stimulus, to make it easier to scrub clean. But they were too late. The stimulus wasn't external anymore. I closed my eyes, and I wasn't in the cell. I was back in the field. Leo's memory wasn't a recording I could play back. It had become a part of my own landscape. I could feel the phantom warmth of that yellow sun on my skin, smell the sweet, earthy scent of the grass. I could feel the small, smooth stone in my pocket, a treasure found on a perfect afternoon, and I could feel the love for the woman who was my mother, a love so vast and unconditional it felt like a star burning in my chest. With it came the loss, a chasm so deep and absolute that my own small griefs, the loss of my parents in a shuttle accident, the loneliness of my profession seemed like shallow streams next to this dead ocean. They thought they had quarantined me, but they had locked me in a room with 1 billion souls. And they were all beginning to whisper. Kyle was a man drowning in data. In the Concordance Command Center, holographic screens painted the air with charts, reports, and escalating alert icons. The Warden AI was now flagging over 15% of the station's population for anomalous neural activity. The dreams of the green field were now so common they had a designation Memetic Anomaly 734, but it was more than dreams. A Sill librarian had been found in the deep archives, weeping over a blank data slate, whispering the name Anna. A Qthar engineer, a species known for their stoic practicality, had inexplicably begun carving intricate floral patterns into the hull plating of a cargo bay, humming a tune no one recognized. Every incident was logged, cross-referenced, and analyzed. The data pointed to a contagion, but it had no vector. It spread without contact, without a signal, without any logical means of transmission. It was a ghost haunting the entire station. His top technicians had run every diagnostic imaginable on the Lullaby box. They bombarded it with radiation, scanned its quantum state, dissected its energy signature. Their conclusion was as frustrating as it was terrifying the box was. For all intents and purposes, inert. It was a perfectly preserved piece of primitive technology, a simple holographic projector. There was no virus, no nanotech, no psychic resonance emitter. It was just a box, yet Kale had felt it. In my workshop, standing in the golden glow, he had felt a tremor in the foundations of his own carefully constructed reality, a flicker of warmth, a pang of a sorrow that wasn't his. He had logged it in his personal report as auditory and sensory hallucination due to proximity to a Class 4 memetic hazard. It was a neat, tidy explanation. It was a lie, and he knew it. He pulled up my file. Ilera, Mender, Class 3, orphaned, solitary, no history of mental instability, top marks in subneural engineering and pre-silence technology. I was the patient zero. The source. Logic dictated that if he could break me, if he could extract the source code of this virus from my mind, he could create an antidote. He ordered my transfer to an interrogation chamber. The interrogation room was even colder than the cell. The table between us was black, reflective, and seemed to suck the light out of the air. Kyle sat opposite me, his posture perfect, his face unreadable. He didn't have a weapon, but the entire room felt like one, designed to exert pressure, to break down a mind piece by piece. The phenomenon is spreading. He began, his voice flat. We are tracking a cascading memetic failure across the station. It originated with you, with that object. I met his gaze. His eyes were the color of a stormy sea, full of conflict he was desperately trying to suppress. It's not an object, I said, my voice clearer than I expected. It's a key. A key to what a weapon system, a dormant virus he pressed, leaning forward. No, it's a key to a memory. Kale scoffed, a short, sharp sound of disbelief. Memories are data, Ilara. They can be copied, corrupted, deleted. What is happening is not data. It's chaos. It's emotion. It is a flaw in the system. Humanity was a flaw in the system. I replied, and the thought came to me with the certainty of a truth I had always known. They were chaotic and emotional, and they loved so fiercely they burned holes in reality. You think they just died. A species like that doesn't just cease to exist. They don't just go silent. The records are clear, he insisted, his voice rising slightly. They exhausted their resources. Their political structures collapsed. They destroyed themselves. We destroyed them. I whispered, and the memory of Leo's mother, her face turning from love to terror, flashed behind my eyes. We didn't help. We didn't listen. We stood by and watched them burn. And when the smoke cleared, we built our quiet, orderly galaxy on their ashes. We called it peace. It was desecration. We didn't just let them die. We forgot them. On purpose. And that was the real crime. Kyle slammed his hand on the table, the sound cracking through the sterile silence. This is delusion. You have been compromised by a hostile agent. I will have the truth. He keyed a command into the table's integrated panel. A moment later, a medical drone floated silently into the room. A slender neural probe extending from its chassis. This is your last chance to cooperate. We will extract the data packet from your neural cortex. It may cause degradation, but it will give us what we need to synthesize an inoculant. I looked at the needle, then back at him. I wasn't afraid. Fear seemed like such a small thing now. You can't extract a ghost. Kyle, you can't put a soul in a specimen jar. He gave a curt nod to the drone. Proceed. The drone moved towards me, the needle gleaming. I didn't resist. I closed my eyes and focused on the field of grass, on the warmth of the sun, on the feeling of a small hand in mine. As the probe neared my temple, I focused all of the memory, all of Leo's love and loss, into a single point. I didn't push it out. I just held it. The moment the probe made contact, the room went white, not with light, but with feeling. An explosion of pure, unfiltered emotion that had been contained within the lullaby box for 300 years, now channeled through me. The drone short-circuited, falling to the floor with a clatter of dead metal. Kale cried out, stumbling back from the table, his hands flying to his head. His eyes were wide with a terror that had nothing to do with me. I hadn't projected the full memory into him. I couldn't have. But he had been standing on the shore, and a single drop from the ocean of human grief had just splashed onto his face. He saw it, just for a second. The blue sky, the woman's smile, the shadow falling. He gasped for air. His rigid control shattered into a million pieces. He looked at me, not as a prisoner, not as a source of infection, but as a harbinger, a messenger from a past his entire civilization had tried to erase. I stood up, the chains that had held me to the chair falling away, their locks having fused in the energy backlash. I walked to the table and leaned towards him, my voice no longer just my own, but echoing with the whispers of a billion lost voices. It's not a virus you're fighting. Kyle, I said softly, the truth of it settling over the room like a shroud. It's a haunting. And it's not just on this station. It's in all of us. You can't quarantine a memory that's already yours. He stared at me, his face pale, his breath ragged. For the first time, he looked truly lost. The mender was gone. The officer was gone. We were just two people in a room, listening to the ghosts, finally realizing that the silence was about to break. The aftermath of the failed interrogation was not a lockdown, but a fracturing. Kyle didn't report what had happened. There was no protocol for an emotional detonation, no classification for a weapon that attacked not the body or the mind, but the soul. He sealed the interrogation room, citing a catastrophic power surge, and had me return to my cell in level Gamma, But the locks were no longer for containment. They were for his own protection. He was afraid of me, not for what I could do, but for what I represented, a truth that could not be cataloged, quarantined, or controlled. He needed time to think, but thought was no longer a sanctuary. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw a flash of blue sky. Every time the station's comms chimed, he heard the faint echo of a woman screaming a name he didn't know. The single drop of grief I had shown him had been a seed, and it was now taking root in the sterile soil of his vexed mind. He was becoming compromised, not by a virus, but by empathy. Meanwhile, the haunting of the Athenaeum intensified. It was no longer just dreams and whispers. The station itself seemed to be remembering. In the botanical sector, where alien flora were cultivated in carefully controlled environments, a single unfamiliar plant began to grow in every hydroponics tray. It was a tall, green stalk with thin blades grass. No one knew where the seeds came from. In the sonic archives, where the great symphonies of 1,000 species were stored as pure frequency, phantom melodies began to overlay the recordings. Simple, haunting tunes played on stringed instruments and human voices singing of loss and longing. The Warden AI, in an attempt to purge these auditory corruptions, succeeded only in weaving them deeper into the archives, until a Vex battle hymn sounded like a lament, and a Qthar mathematical chant was underpinned by the soft strumming of a guitar. The ghosts were no longer just whispering, they were redecorating. The station's population began to divide. There were the unaffected, those who, for whatever reason, were immune to the memories. They saw the spreading phenomenon as a plague, a mental sickness that was eroding the station's order. They rallied behind Kyle, demanding stricter quarantines, mass neural wipes, a return to the quiet, predictable reality they knew. They began to wear silver armbands, a symbol of their purity of mind, their freedom from the human contagion. Then there were the rememberers. We were the ones who dreamt of the green fields, who heard the phantom music, who found ourselves weeping for a loss we couldn't name. We were a disparate group of engineers and librarians, pilots and cooks from a dozen different species, united by a shared, impossible nostalgia. We began to seek each other out, gathering in darkened maintenance tunnels and decommissioned storage bays, not to plot or rebel, but simply to share the experience. A hulking Qthar mechanic, a being of pure logic, would describe the irrational feeling of love for a child he'd never had. A Sill, whose species communicated through crystalline resonance, would try to translate the human concept of a promise into shifting light patterns. I became their reluctant focal point, smuggled out of level Gamma by a sympathetic guard who had started dreaming of a younger brother he never had. I found myself leading these strange, sad gatherings. I didn't have answers. All I had was the memory of Leo, which had now become a clear, complete narrative in my mind. I could remember his whole life, from the warmth of his mother's arms to the cold terror of the shadow that fell from the sky. I shared his story, and in the telling, it became a kind of scripture for our small, broken congregation. Leo wasn't just a boy anymore. He was a symbol of what had been lost. The unaffected, now calling themselves the Silver Guard, grew more aggressive. They saw our gatherings as cult meetings, our shared grief as a dangerous delusion. Fights broke out in the mess halls. Families were torn apart. The station, once a quiet monument to the past, was becoming a battleground for its memory. Kyle was caught in the middle. The Silver Guard saw him as their leader, the only one with the authority to purge the infection, but he couldn't bring himself to give the order for mass neural wipes. The memory of the blue sky, the woman's smile, haunted him. To erase that from the minds of the rememberers would be an act of violence. A second murder. He was a keeper of order. But what if order meant erasing a truth? What if stability was just a word for a well-tended lie? He began spending his off-duty hours in my old workshop, which he had kept sealed. He would sit in the dark, staring at the inert lullaby box, trying to understand the force it had unleashed. He ran scans, analyzed data, and found nothing. Frustrated, he did something illogical, something a Vex officer would never do. He reached out and touched it. And, for a moment, the box responded not with light or sound, but with a feeling. Not the overwhelming grief I had channeled, but something quieter, more personal. He felt a phantom weight in his arms, the feeling of holding a sleeping child. He felt a surge of fierce, protective love for this child that was not his, for a life that was not real. The feeling vanished as quickly as it came, but it left him shaken to his core. He finally understood. The box wasn't a weapon. It was a tombstone. And the memories weren't the attack. They were the epitaph. He sought me out, finding me in a makeshift sanctuary we had created in a vast, forgotten cargo bay. We had collected the strange grass from the botanical labs and planted it in shipping crates under jury-rigged sun lamps. Here, surrounded by the impossible green, the rememberers would sit in silence, finding a strange comfort in this shared phantom home. Kyle stood at the entrance, his silver concordance uniform looking stark and out of place. The rememberers tensed, ready for a confrontation. I held up a hand, and they settled. I walked to him, the soft, living grass cool beneath my bare feet. You felt it, didn't you? I asked. He didn't answer, but the conflict in his eyes was answer enough. They're not just memories of death, I said softly. They're memories of life, of love. That's why they're so strong. That's why they hurt so much. What do they want? He finally asked, his voice low, almost a whisper. Why now, after 300 years of silence? Before I could answer, an alarm blared through the station, a jarring, discordant sound I had never heard before. It wasn't a fire alarm or a hull breach warning. It was the warden's highest level alert, a signal reserved for an existential threat to the Athenaeum itself. On the far wall of the cargo bay, a massive view screen, previously dark, flickered to life. It showed a live feed from the station's long-range sensors. For a moment, there was nothing but the familiar, star-dusted blackness of deep space. Then, something shifted. It was like a fold in the fabric of space, a distortion that wasn't a warp signature or a jump gate opening. It was something else, something ancient and impossible. From this fold, an object emerged. It was vast, easily the size of a small moon, and its design was unlike anything any of us had ever seen. It was a lattice of crystalline structures and dark, organic-looking matter, woven together into a shape that was both beautiful and deeply unsettling. It absorbed the light of the distant stars, giving it the appearance of a hole in the universe. It was not a ship. It was something else. And as it drifted silently towards the Athenaeum, a single, system-wide broadcast opened on all channels. It wasn't a voice, or music, or a data packet. It was a feeling of profound, ancient, and patient hunger. The Silver Guards saw the object as a confirmation of their fears. This was the source of the infection, the hostile agent, the alien weapon come to finish the job. They demanded Kale arm the station's dormant defense systems. But Kale was staring at the screen, his face pale. The Warden AI was running trillions of analyses per second, comparing the object's energy signature to every known species, every known technology. The results were all negative. It was an unknown. But I knew, the moment I saw it, a new layer of Leo's memory unlocked in my mind. The shadow that fell from the sky, that swallowed the sun, that had devoured his world. It wasn't a metaphor for war or collapse. It was real, and it was here. "That's not them," I said, my voice trembling as the full, horrifying truth of the Great Silence finally dawned on me. Kale turned to me, his eyes wide with confusion. "Not who." I looked from the terrifying object on the screen to the small, pathetic patches of green grass at our feet, a memory of a world that was gone. "That's not humanity," I said, the words catching in my throat. "That's what's left of what ate them." The lullaby box hadn't been a tombstone. It was a warning. The memories weren't an attack. They were a message in a bottle, a final desperate cry for help from a species on the brink of extinction, sent across an ocean of time. They weren't haunting us. They were trying to warn us. And we had been too busy fighting their ghosts to realize the monster was real. The arrival of the entity, which the Warden AI, in a moment of uncharacteristic poetry, had designated the Umbras, plunged the Athenaeum into a state of cold, quiet panic. The Umbra did not communicate. It did not threaten. It simply hung in the void, a silent, light-devouring anomaly that defied every known law of physics. Its presence was a psychic weight, a constant, low-level hum of dread that permeated every corner of the station. The Silver Guards' calls for action became frantic. They saw the Umbra as the final proof of their xenophobic fears, a physical manifestation of the mental contagion they had been fighting. To them, the Rememberers were not just victims. We were collaborators. Minds softened and made vulnerable by the human infection, ready to welcome this new, greater threat. Kyle, however, was paralyzed. The sliver of human memory he had experienced the phantom warmth of a sleeping child. The terror of the falling shadow had fractured his vexed certainty. He could no longer see the universe in the clean, binary terms of order and chaos, known and unknown. He saw a third state, the forgotten. He understood now that the human memories were not the disease, but a symptom of a much older wound. To arm the station's defenses and fire on the Umbra felt like a hollow gesture, like a child throwing stones at a hurricane. For the Rememberers, the Umbra's arrival was a terrifying validation. The fragmented memories we carried the sense of a looming, unnamed dread. The final, desperate moments of a world ending, not with a bang, but with a silent, comprehensive erasure snapped into focus. Leo's memory was no longer just a story of a boy and his mother. It was the story of the last moments of sunlight before an eternal eclipse. The shadow from his memory was real, and it was now casting itself over us. Our small gatherings in the cargo bay transformed from therapy sessions into councils of war, though we had no weapons to speak of. Our only asset was the memories themselves. We began to work systematically, pooling our fragmented experiences, trying to assemble a coherent picture of what had happened to humanity. It was like assembling a billion-piece jigsaw puzzle in the dark. A still rememberer recalled the memory of a scientist watching sensor readings go haywire, muttering about a null space entity that seemed to feed on consciousness. A Q-Thar remembered being a soldier on a starship, his crew's minds being systematically unwritten as they got closer to a spatial distortion. Every memory was a piece of the mosaic, and the picture that emerged was one of a horror beyond comprehension. The Umbra wasn't a conqueror. It didn't destroy worlds with energy weapons or kinetic bombardments. It consumed them. It fed on the collective consciousness of a species, erasing its memories, its culture, its very identity, leaving behind nothing but empty vessels and silent worlds. The Great Silence wasn't the sound of humanity's absence. It was the sound of its digestion. I became the nexus of this effort. The lullaby box, which I had reclaimed from my workshop, acted as an amplifier, a focusing lens. Holding it, I could dive deeper into the shared ocean of human memory. I relived the final days of Earth, not as Leo the child, but as 100 different people. I was a general ordering a feudal retreat, a poet writing a final verse to a lover she would never see again, a philosopher contemplating the end of history as a living entity swallowed the sky. I saw their desperate, final gambit. They couldn't fight the Umbra. It was like trying to punch a hole in the ocean. So they did the only thing they could. They turned their entire civilization into a message. They encoded their memories, their love, their grief, their very essence into a quantum-entangled signal and aimed it at the only thing they believed might survive, their own scattered, forgotten, primitive technology. The lullaby boxes, the data slates, the dormant communication relays left behind in their abandoned territories, they turned them all into time capsules, into seeds of memory, hoping that one day another species would be curious enough, or compassionate enough, to listen. It wasn't a call for help. It was a warning. Here is the monster that ate us. Do not make our mistakes. Remember. As we pieced together this truth, Kyle was fighting his own battle. The Silver Guard, their fear stoked by the Umbra's silent, menacing presence, staged a coup. They seized control of the Concordance Command Center, placing Kyle under house arrest. Their leader, a zealous Vex traditionalist named Boral, declared a state of emergency. He announced his intention to activate the Athenaeum's ultimate defense, the Kronos Field. It was a weapon of last resort, a theoretical construct that had never been tested. It was designed to create a temporal bubble around the station, effectively removing it from the normal flow of time for a predetermined period. Boral's plan was to bubble the station for a century, hoping the Umbra would simply move on. It was a plan born of pure terror, a decision to hide rather than to understand. Kyle, locked in his quarters, knew this was a death sentence. The human memories had taught him that you couldn't run from a thing that fed on absence. The Kronos Field wouldn't save them. It would just marinate them. He also knew something else. The Athenaeum wasn't just an archive. It was a power source. The station's core was a contained singularity, a feat of engineering that provided near-limitless energy. The human memories I had unlocked gave him a new, terrifying context for this. He realized the station's core was almost identical in its energy signature to the power sources described in the memories of humanity's starships. The Athenaeum hadn't been built by the current galactic species. It had been built by humanity. It was one of their great archive stations, abandoned during the Silence, and later rediscovered and repurposed by species who had no idea of its true origin. The Umbra hadn't found the Athenaeum by chance. It had followed the scent of its old prey. It was here to finish its meal. Kyle knew he had to act. Using his command overrides, he sent a coded message to the one person he knew could understand me. The message was a schematic of the station's core and a single, cryptic question: can a memory be weaponized? I understood immediately. He wasn't asking if we could fight. He was asking if we could communicate. The Umbra fed on consciousness. But what if we could feed it something it couldn't digest? What if we could give it a memory so powerful, so filled with the paradoxical pain and beauty of human existence, that it would choke on it? It was an insane plan, a desperate gamble based on a ghost story. It was our only hope. The Rememberers organized a diversion. We staged a mass protest in the Central Plaza, drawing the attention of Boral and the Silver Guard. While they were busy containing the infected, a small team of us, a Qthar engineer who remembered how to bypass human-era conduits, a Sil who could sense the flow of energy through the station systems, and me made our way towards the station's core. The journey was a descent into the station's forgotten history. The deeper we went, the more the architecture changed. The sterile, functional design of the upper levels gave way to sweeping, graceful curves and inscriptions in a language I now recognized as English. We were walking through a human cathedral, a place of knowledge they had built to last an eternity, now being used as a warehouse by their unwitting inheritors. We reached the core chamber, a vast sphere suspended in a web of magnetic containment fields. The air thrummed with unimaginable power. The Qthar engineer, his hands moving with an inherited certainty, began to reroute the primary energy conduits, creating a feedback loop that would channel the core's power directly into the main comms array. The Sil, her crystalline body glowing softly, monitored the energy flows, guiding him, humming a soft, sad human tune as she worked. My job was the most difficult. I had to be the vessel. I sat before the primary interface, a smooth, black console that had been dormant for centuries. I placed the lullaby box on its surface, taking a deep breath. I placed my hands on the box and reached out not to a single memory, but to all of them. I opened my mind to the entire ocean of human experience. It was an agony and an ecstasy. I felt a billion lives at once. I felt the joy of a first kiss, the pain of a final goodbye, the quiet satisfaction of a difficult job well done, the rage of injustice, the fierce, irrational love for a child. I felt the entire messy, contradictory, beautiful, and terrible tapestry of what it meant to be human. I gathered it all, every last drop of it, into a single point of incandescent feeling. Love. It was the only word for it. Not a simple, gentle love, but a ferocious, star-burning, universe-creating love. The love Leo's mother had for him. The love that had compelled a dying species to turn their own ghosts into a warning for strangers they would never meet. This was our weapon, a love bomb. As the core's power surged and the comms array began to glow, I prepared to broadcast our message, not to the Umbra's mind, but to its stomach. We were going to give the monster a meal it would never forget. I looked at my companions, a stoic engineer and a shimmering crystal, working together to save a station full of people who hated them, guided by the ghosts of a species they never knew. In that moment, we were all human. I closed my eyes and pushed the entirety of that feeling, the entirety of that memory, into the stream. The moment I released the memory, the station screamed. It was not a sound of metal or energy, but a psychic shriek that tore through the mind of every living being on the Athenaeum. The core chamber flooded with a light that was not light, a golden, emotional radiance that felt like standing in the heart of a sun made of pure joy and sorrow. The feedback loop kicked in, and the entirety of the human experience, a billion lives compressed into a single, infinitely dense point of feeling, shot out from the main comms array as a wave of pure empathy. On the main view screen in the Concordance Command Center, Boral and the Silver Guard watched in stunned terror as a shimmering, golden wave erupted from the Athenaeum and washed over the Umbra. For a moment, nothing happened. The Umbra simply absorbed the wave, its dark, silent mass seeming to drink in the light without effect. Boral let out a triumphant cry, believing our insane gambit had failed. Then, the Umbra shuddered. It was a subtle, full-body tremor, like a beast of prey having a seizure. Patches of its inky, light-devouring surface began to flicker, not with energy, but with images. A field of green grass under a yellow sun, the face of a woman, smiling, a fleet of silver starships burning in the void. It was a cosmic indigestion. The Umbra had fed on the simple, primal consciousness of countless species, but it had never encountered anything like humanity. It had never tasted a species that could love so fiercely in the face of its own extinction, that could find beauty in its own tragedy, that could feel grief so profound it could be weaponized. The pure, chaotic, contradictory emotion was a poison to its simple, predatory existence. The Umbra began to unravel. Its form, once a stable, geometric anomaly, started to warp and distort. It was not exploding. It was dissolving, like a nightmare unable to hold its shape in the light of dawn. As its physical form degraded, it released the consciousness it had consumed, a wave of pure psychic energy, a cacophony of 1,000 different species' final thoughts, washed over the Athenaeum. For the unaffected, it was a moment of agonizing revelation. They were inundated with the final, terrified moments of the species the Umbra had consumed, feeling their fear, their confusion, their despair. They finally understood what true extinction felt like, and in that understanding, their fear of the rememberers dissolved into a profound and terrible shame. They saw that we hadn't been infected, we had been inoculated by a lesser, sadder truth, preparing us for this greater, more horrifying one. For the rememberers, the wave was different. The human memories we carried acted as a shield, a filter. We still felt the terror of the dying species, but it was cushioned by the stubborn, irrational hope that was humanity's final legacy. We didn't just feel their end, we felt the love for the lives they had lived, a gift from a species that had learned to cherish every moment before the shadow fell. And for me, in the core chamber, I experienced something else entirely. As the Umbra dissolved, I felt a new presence touch my mind. It wasn't the cacophony of the consumed, nor was it the familiar echo of the human memories. It was a single, clear, and impossibly ancient consciousness. It was the Umbra itself. I felt its confusion, its pain. It had only ever known hunger. It moved from world to world, feeding, growing, following a simple, cosmic imperative. It had no concept of malice, of good or evil. It was a force of nature, like a black hole or a supernova. But the human memory had changed it. It had introduced a new variable into its ancient equation grief. For the first time, The Umbra was feeling the pain of the lives it had taken. It was experiencing the loss it had created, and the sensation was tearing it apart. I felt its final thought, not as a word, but as a concept, a sudden shocking moment of self-awareness. I am a monster. And then it was gone. The space where it had been was empty, wiped clean. The stars behind it, which had been blotted out, shone with a fierce, brilliant clarity, as if they too had been liberated. In the aftermath, the silence that fell over the Athenaeum was different. It wasn't the strained, fearful quiet of before. It was a silence of awe, of contemplation. The Silver Guard disbanded, its members quietly removing their armbands, their faces etched with a new, somber understanding. Boral surrendered his command to Kale without a word, his zealotry shattered by the forced empathy he had experienced. There would be no more talk of purges or quarantines. Everyone on the station was a rememberer now, of one kind or another. The station itself was changed. The strange grass from the botanical labs began to grow in cracks in the corridor floors. The phantom melodies from the archives could now be heard faintly over the station-wide comms, a permanent, gentle undercurrent to daily life. The Athenaeum was no longer just an archive of dead tech. It was a living monument to the species that had saved them all. Kyle and I stood together in my old workshop. The lullaby box sat on the workbench, its light extinguished, its purpose served. It was just a box again, a simple child's toy. Its song was over. "They didn't just save us," Kyle said, his voice filled with a reverence I never thought I'd hear from a Vex. "They changed us. They gave us a context for our own existence." He was right. The species of the galaxy had built their civilizations on a foundation of logic, order, and fear of the unknown. Humanity had given them a new foundation: empathy. They had taught us that grief was not a weakness, but a measure of love. They had taught us that memory was not just data, but a sacred duty. We were no longer just the inheritors of their abandoned territory. We were the inheritors of their soul. My life as a mender was over. I was now a different kind of translator, not of dead tech, but of a living memory. I traveled the station, and later, other worlds. Not as a leader, but as a storyteller. I told the story of Leo, of a boy in a field under a blue sky, and of the shadow that fell. I told the story of a species that, in its final moments, chose to transform its own extinction into a gift. We started a new archive in the heart of the Athenaeum. We didn't fill it with artifacts or data slates. We filled it with stories. Every species that had been touched by the human memory, or the final echo of the Umbra, sent emissaries to record their experiences, to share their histories, their art, their concepts of love and loss. The Great Silence was finally, truly over, replaced by a great conversation. Humanity was gone, but they were also everywhere. They were in the green grass that now grew on a dozen worlds whose inhabitants had never seen a field. They were in the sad, beautiful songs sung in 100 different languages. They were in the quiet moments of empathy between strangers, a shared, inherited grief for a family none of us had ever known, but all of us had lost. They were the ghost in our machine, the silent whisper that reminded us that to be alive is to love, to lose, and, above all, to remember.